Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patrick, and today we're going to discuss a little bit about the evolution of the working woman and her home life. I will start in about 1960 and go ahead and go through the present. At the beginning, we're going to go ahead and look at the kind of a comparison between the two. Then we're going to go back and actually look at how that evolution took place. All right. So, if we go ahead and start at the post-World War II era, we can take a look back at the suburban housewife of the 1960s, and we can see that the women of the era really had a very little time for themselves, as when their husband went to work in what was usually the family's only car, she was often subjugated to hours of boredom interspersed by housework and the ever-present need to play the idyllic passive housewife that was idealized by the leave it to beaver generation. Uh, these post-World War II women had on average first marriage at around 20, and then their first child about 14 months after that. Women of the 1950s and 60s often lived a solitary life in a homogeneous neighborhood, where the majority of women were at the same age or in the same stage of life, so children were the same age. This boredom was often interrupted only by the occasional PTA meeting or the game of bridge. Uh, they often did face a stigma if they decided to, work outside the home, and their college kind of stopped the second they got married. Now, if we go ahead and compare that to the women of today, we can see that there is a great difference. Um, Women no longer settle for just kind of standing in the kitchen waiting on children and husbands. They are entrepreneurs, physicians, and lawyers, as well as mothers and housewives. They outnumber men in colleges, and women now receive 55% of college degrees. They've kind of stopped marrying young, shying away from that, marrying on average at around the age of 24, and postponing children until 3 years after that. So the once homogeneous neighborhoods has really kind of been transformed into a melting pot of cultures and age groups. Now, a survey of about 40-something women illustrates kind of the scale of this divergence from the June Cleaver culture of the 1950s. Of these women, there were some were just having their first child, others had children in college, and some had children in college and were actually starting another young family with a second husband, and some were even single mothers. All of them, though, were fulfilling themselves outside of the home rather than looking for uh, and staying home and accepting kind of the boredom of the previous 1950s to 1960s women. Now that we have seen how drastic the changes from the 1950s to today are, let's look at how these changes came along. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War were both in full swing, and Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, had been around for about nearly a decade when still sending shockwaves through the culture. Finding that the depression many housewives felt was based on the desire for self-fulfillment outside of the home, these repressed and educated women often pushed their daughters towards a different direction of their own, making the next generation of women really the first second-wave feminists. The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s really gave women a surge kind of in self-confidence, as they really felt a kindred spirit with other oppressed minority groups who are also being neglected or overlooked by a male-dominated society. Now, through demonstrations such as the one that occurred during the Miss America pageant in 1968, now it was during this demonstration that 150 women crowded the boardwalks of Atlantic City to protest the passive, idyllic housewife that the pageant held in such high esteem. Now, these types of demonstrations were not ignored by lawmakers who, following the lead of President John F. Kennedy, who in the early 1960s instituted the President's Council on the Status of Women, enacted the Equal Rights Act. Now, this Equal Rights Act was championed by first-wave feminist hero Alice Paul. And now this act effectively wanted to go ahead and remove the word sex from the Constitution, and it actually went through the House very quickly. Unfortunately, in about 1977, this highly anticipated act actually went ahead and petered out, unfortunately. And to me, this was actually one of the biggest missed opportunities of second-wave feminism, as it really would have equaled out the playing field between men and women. It was also during this time that conscious raising groups were formed, where like-minded people kind of met and discussed similar experiences that may have had about oppression and inequality. It was also during this time that women's shelters were kind of first opened to protect women and give them a place to go who were either on the street or relieving an abusive relationship. Now, in the 1970s, women's rights groups continued to go ahead and protest, doing demonstrations such as sit-ins throughout the country. But the real interesting thing here is they kind of splintered into three different factions. The first really focused on kind of lobbying government for equality. The second was more radical and kind of thought that the entire situation needed to be kind of torn down and society needed to be built back up on a more level playing field. The third was actually kind of the most passive of the group, and that really thought that the sexes should kind of be celebrated and cultivated as different entities, and thought that the women's rights activities were really kind of diluting women's culture and making women seem more like men. It was during this time that kind of books came out about women's rights, and they all were all bestsellers on. And some of these were, Millet's Sexual Politics, Firestone's Dialectic of Sex, and The Female Eunuch. By the late 1970s, the movement had made strong headways towards equality, succeeding in making it illegal to discriminate in education based on sex. This further opened up the job field by breaking down barriers that kept women from participating in many fields. It granted the equal division of property and divorce, which allowed women to exist in relationships without having to worry about being destitute if the relationship fell apart. For all the advantages that women have today have over the women of the late 1950s and early 1960s, there are unfortunately still some similarities. Women in the same job do still make about 80% of what a man makes. And since women decide to take time off to have kids, they normally do have less seniority at companies, making them the first to be laid off and downsizing. Such similarities and kind of differences do kind of make the women's movement ongoing, and it is something that I look forward to seeing kind of resolve itself hopefully in the near future.